Hey fellow brewers, in this video I'm going to show you end-to-end brewing condensed. I've taken a little video each day, starting with planning, making the yeast starter, doing the brew day, stages during fermenting, dry hopping, kegging, and everything, and condensed it down so that you can see my entire process from end to end. I will tell you I make a lot of mistakes along the way, and I'll point those out. And part of home brewing is just learning from those mistakes and getting better each brew. So the first thing I do is I plan my brews out. And I like to use OneNote, just keeps everything organized. I use Beersmith for all the recipes and everything, and I really wish it had a better way of tracking, all your different notes and pictures and different versions of brews and things like that. But as you can see here, I've got various brews that I've done, and I plan them out. You can see here I'm trying different recipes out from different, either from magazines or from Northern Brewer or from More Beer or wherever I might find, or even some I designed myself. And you can see here I kind of plan them out, and then on each one of the brews, I track pictures. I take really good notes, and I even take snapshots of my Beersmith just so I have a record of what it was at the time. I've got this brew day sheet that I print out. And I even take pictures of the malts and the hops and my different readings and the mash temperatures I hit and all that. The point being, if I make a really good beer or if there's a problem with a brew, I can look back at my notes and figure out what went wrong. In a perfect world, this would all be in one piece of software where we could track everything, but unfortunately it's not. So I mainly use a combination of OneNote. And then I also use Beersmith. So now that I have a brew planned, I know I'm going to brew on Saturday. I usually do Saturday or Sunday, depending on what's going on at home. The first thing I'm going to do is make a yeast starter. So I'm trying to make it about 36 hours before I'm going to pitch that yeast. So right now it's just after work on a Thursday. It's about 4:30 p.m. So first thing I do is I'm going to get my yeast out of the fridge here. And as part of getting the yeast out, I'm also going to take a note of the date it was manufactured, so that I can plug those numbers into my software. It'll give me an idea of the viability, and just make sure that for the type of beer that I'm making, that I'll have enough yeast cells and enough yeast packets is really what it comes down to. So I know for a fact I'm making an ale. One packet with the starter gets it done every time, at least with the type of mostly session strength or just a little bit higher strength that I brew. So now I've got the yeast out, and I'm going to let this sit for about 3 hours. And probably in just a little bit, I'll go ahead and make the starter and try and time it so that once it's cool, I want to immediately get that yeast in there. So let me show you my starter setup here. So I got this on the internet, stirplace.com, and I like the idea that it's somebody that, it's not a big company, it's just somebody that makes these at probably at their home or just a small business, and I really like supporting that. But what I have here is it's a Pyrex jar, and basically it's a it's going to hold my yeast starter while the stir plate is stirring it. The other nice thing about this Pyrex jar is that I can put it directly on the fire, and later when I record the next video for this, I'll show you that. Now it's very important that you get the Pyrex or some kind of borosilicate glass, because you want to be careful that you don't have an exploding glass situation on your hands if you were to put this on the stove. So I got this one on Amazon. It holds 2,000 milliliters here, so that usually does me for my starters. I'm typically making a 1,000 milliliter starter. My yeast has been out for a couple hours now. It's starting to warm up. It's getting to be about time where I want to make my wort. So what I've got here is I've got my Erlenmeyer flask. I've got a digital scale, and I've got this funnel. And after experimenting a few different ways of trying to get the dried malt extract right here, The best way to get that into here without making a huge mess is to put it in while it's dry like this. So you notice I've got my little stir bar down there, and I've got this funnel that I found on eBay, came from somewhere in China, and I've got my dried malt extract. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and turn this guy on, and that'll immediately set it to 0 with everything that's on it. And I want to put the dried malt extract in at a ratio of 10 to 1. So what that means is for 1,000 milliliters of wort here, that I'm going to want to put in 100 grams of my dried malt extract. And I find that that formula is pretty reliable. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll put in 100 grams and I'll go ahead and fill the water up to just a little bit over 1,000 milliliters, because a little bit of oil off, but not too much. So let me go ahead and fill that and I'll be right back. I've added just over 1,000 milliliters of water, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put in a few drops of this firm cap. I really recommend this if you're going to boil in the flask like this, just to keep it from boiling over. I usually put about 4 or 5 drops in there. I've got the flask directly on the gas. It's just started to boil and I set the timer for 15 minutes. Got some potatoes cooking over here too. The 15 minutes is up, it's all boiled down. So the first thing I like to do is get some foil on top of this thing. You don't want any contaminants getting in there. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and move this over. I got this handy Kia bowl here, and I'm going to go dump some ice on it. So I just need to swirl it around for just a little while. It'll cool down really quickly. It's all cooled down. I'm just doing it by touch. I'm not taking a temperature reader or anything. What I prefer to do is just put it on the stir plate for a little bit and just kind of let it get to room temperature. So let's go ahead and do that now. So what I'd like to do is we need to get this little stir bar down in the middle. There we go, work that guy down. And then get it on the stir plate. And then we can just slowly turn it up. And it didn't grab the stir bar, so what I'll do is turn it down. Oh, that's a lie. So we need to kind of get it to the middle here. There we go. I think it just grabbed it. Then slowly turn it up. And I see some action. There we go. Now we'll just let it spin for a bit. In the meantime, the sheets can just chill out. We're gonna kind of warm up to room temperature. We've cooled to room temperature. Just gotta get the sanitizer out here. Spray a little bit on the skizzers. I've already shaken the packet up a little bit. I'm gonna spray some on the packet. And I'm gonna spray some on the other side too. And we're gonna give that some time to work. Just a few seconds. I'm dumping the yeast in here. This is a pretty sticky batch of yeast. Almost like an English yeast or something like that. So this is why we sanitize it, because sticking it right down in there. Now I've got the yeast in there. I've got the foil back on. There we go. Once I get either I buy the grains all and all the supplies separately, or I get a recipe kit. When I'm planning my brew day, the first thing I'll do is come in here, and I have a cloud account with the Beersmith, and it lets me hold quite a few recipes. So that's really good. I have a base recipe that I use as kind of a starter, and I use that, I clone it, and so today what we're going to be brewing is this Traveling Man Ale that I got off More Beer. And I go through the ingredients and I carefully figure out what type of grain it is, what type of hops it is, you know, what the acid is on that on the hops, and put all those variables in to come up with my targets. And I will spend more time on this on another show, but I just want to go through the whole workflow. I set up my starter, and I put in the package date. That's why I take lots of pictures and everything like that. And you can see here that we're good on if we were to just use no starters, it was 3 package, and with a starter, it's 1 package. So I always use a starter. I keep track of my mash in here. So recently I've switched over to just not mashing out. And so you can see here I'm doing a single infusion, medium body, no mash out. The temperature from the recipe, and I can adjust all my variables here, including the pH that I'm trying to hit. The session will keep track of all the where I expect things to be, and then the notes is I usually grab things, tasting notes and notes about preparation and things like that. So once I've got this recipe in place, the other thing that I have is I have my overall workflow. So if we go back to the OneNote, what I do is I have this, and I recommend all you guys have it, just basically like a standard checklist or flow as you go through your brew day, because you'll forget things otherwise. And this is kind of a checklist. So I'll print one of these out for each brews, and I will take notes while I'm brewing, because I don't want my computer down there and the risk getting water all over it or whatever. So I'll print this out, and I'll also print out the brew process sheet from over here. So I go over to the cloud, and you can see here that there's a brew process text. I find that this prints the best, and it's got all the individual steps, like how much water I need and things like that. And like I said before, I will spend more time in the future talking about how to calculate all these things. Today's brew day, and I've already put my recipe into Beersmith. We can see that over here, and I've calculated everything I need. I'll do a separate session on this, but when I design this, when I add the water that I'm going to use with the profile, it automatically calculates all the different salts to use. So what I do then is I print out this brew sheet, and I just go through it step by step and figure out, like I need 1.85 grams of gypsum and 1.65 grams of calcium chloride, etc., etc. So what I've got here is I've got this this scale that I picked up off Amazon, really cheap. And I got some jars from IKEA to put all my different salts in, so I'm not messing around with all different bags and stuff like that. Got some lactic acid, which is going to change my pH to where I need it to be. Yeah, so pretty much I'll just measure this out, and then on each one I'll reset the scale and then add the next bit. I've got all my different salts in there, if you will. The last thing that I like to add, and I add this to every brew, is one of these Camden tablets. Takes out any chlorine taste in the water. Now that my salts are together, next thing is to get my lactic acid together. And Beersmith has gone ahead and calculated this for me at 2.7 milliliters. Should bring me to right where I want to be for this brew, which is a 5.5 pH. So what I've got here is this lactic acid. I've got this jar here to measure with. And these droppers are really good, and got these off Amazon. This is going to make it easy to get into here. Otherwise you're going to be pouring it all over the place and making a mess. Welcome back. Now that you've seen how the yeast starter has been made, how we've prepared our water salts and the recipes and all that stuff, the next thing is to get started with the brew day. So I thought it would be good if you could have a quick tour of my garage brewery. Probably be a great place to start. I've got a 2-car garage, and I got this old lab table that someone donated to me, and it's really helpful for storing all kinds of stuff. I've got bottles on one side, which I don't do anymore really, and I've got a bunch of equipment and supplies on the other side. You can see I've got one of these Rubbermaid hangers here. I can put all sorts of things up here, like I've got a heater for the winter, and a stir paddle, and all kinds of scoops, and my hop spider and lines. And I find these really helpful for after I get done brewing, hanging my lines up and letting them dry out. On the table here you can see that we've got our salts ready to go. We've got our lactic acid for today. We've got our brewing steps. Got my oxygen bottle. And right now I'm using coolers. They've been working out pretty well for me. And I've also got over here, I've got a couple of pumps. I did an article on the forums a while back on how to build one of these switches for the chugger pumps. I use one of the pumps only for water, and I use one of the other pumps only for work. Just makes it easier to clean, At the end of the brew day, I do clean them all out though, and I'll show you that later on. For a kettle, I'm using the Metal with the Metal burner. I think I bought it because it looked cool, but maybe in future I'll be switching over to electric. I'll tell you, These things get through a lot of propane really quickly. I usually get through about a half tank every brew. Over here, I've got my SS BrewTech, and I've got a brew bucket and a Chronicle. I've also got the glycol chiller. I'll tell you a story about this another time of kind of how this evolved. I started with the bucket, and then eventually I got forced out into the garage. And then at the other end of this, I've got my beer fridge. And at the moment, I've got 4 taps. Only 2 of them have beers in them. We're working on a 3rd right now. By the way, that's not my Bud Light, I swear. I keep all my yeast up here, and I also don't know where that Corona came from. But I keep my yeast up here, my yeast nutrients, hops, things like this. You can see here I've got a manifold with 4 pressure gauges on it, so I can individually control, and I went with different colored tubing so I can, see what's what. And then I've got the tubing all nicely labeled here so I can figure out, like you can see here, I've got line 3 labeled, and I use these tags to label my kegs so I can keep track of what's what. Anyway, like I said, we're going to get started with the brew day. So next thing to talk about is basically my checklist or my workflow. So I recommend that you have some kind of workflow down, some kind of checklist, and you run through it, and every brew day at the end you evaluate it and decide, what's not working. If something's not working, change it next time. This thing has changed many times. The first thing I like to do is rinse out all my equipment. It's been sitting here since the last brew day, at least a couple weeks, and I just want to make sure I get all the dust off. There could be anything out here. There could be little bugs or whatever. So yeah, although it looks clean, I like to give it a good rinse first. The next thing I like to do is to rinse out all my pumps. So I've got these chugger pumps here that help me during the brew day, just so I don't have to worry about lugging things around. So what I do is I just run the water through, and I've got this really long silicone hose that goes out to the driveway. Another really important thing is to rinse out your plate chiller, if you have one, or your counterflow chiller, whatever setup you might have. The reason why is, even though at the end of the brew day, and I'll show you this later, I rinse everything with PBW and then fresh water and everything, there's still gunk in this thing afterwards. So interestingly, in a professional brewery, these plate chillers wouldn't actually be considered food safe. They'd have to be able to disassemble them in case of contamination. So let me just run some water through this thing, and I want you to see, despite all my best efforts for cleaning, we're still going to see a little bit of hop gunk come out. So yeah, probably not easy to see, but there's always just this first patch of gunk. Thought it'd be worth mentioning a quick note about safety. I brew inside the garage. I brew all year long. And one of the things that I've installed is a carbon monoxide detector up here. The other thing that I have at hand is a little bit out of the way, is I have a fire extinguisher. Make sure that it's good. You never know, you just want to be safe. So I have a 15-gallon kettle, and I'm going to fill this all the way up because I'm going to use all the water one way or another, if not for the brew day, maybe for cleaning. And with the filter, what I prefer to do is to run it slowly. We want to give the filter a chance to work and everything like that. So while that's running, we're going to go ahead and do some other things. We're going to start crushing the grains. Over here, I've got my grain mill. So it's a barley crusher. And I also got it with this extra extension on the top, which allows me to put pretty much any brew I've had. It'll at least any 5-gallon brew will fit in there completely. And then over here I've got my grain, and I've got a cordless drill. Here's my first bag of grain. I like to order everything uncrushed, and I like to grind it, just before I use it. That way it keeps a lot longer, and I just feel like it's fresher, which it is. Here's one of the things that I'm not so keen about on these morebeer.com kits. So I ordered the grains uncrushed so that they'll keep quite a long time. However, the base malt arrived unmilled, but then all these little bags arrived and they were already pre-milled. So that being the case, I won't run them through. I'll go ahead and crush my grain first and then add these after the fact. I've got my cordless drill hooked up. So now it's just a matter of just sitting here and waiting. Now that the grains are crushed, the next thing I like to do is get the mill cleaned up. So if you have a garage set up like me or anywhere really, the mice can smell the sweetness of the grain and it'll attract them. So I just like to clean it off and try and keep things as clean as possible. I don't want mice, any kind of issues with that kind of stuff in my brewery. The mill's all cleaned up, and next step is, with this particular kit, we've got some grains that have already been milled, so we'll just dump those in. Now we got all those grains in there, the next thing I like to do is mix it all up. Now there is one thing I do like about these More Beer kits, and that is the way they arrange the hops. So you have to pay very careful attention to how you're using them. But they've done a great job of putting them in the right packet. So if you notice here, when we look at the recipe on this, it calls for the 1 ounce of the Cascade, and that's for bittering for 75 minutes. It's quite a long time. So pretty easy to see. We can look at this one. This is the one that's for 1 ounce. The other Cascade they've reserved for aroma, and notice that they've prepackaged it as ½ ounce. So that'll go in right around here. Also, we've got the Northern Brewer. Notice again we have a 0.5, that's 8.7 acid, and another one that's 0.5. So really nothing to worry about here. So with the Northern Brewer, we've got one for 20 minutes and then one for only 1 minute. That filtered water is still coming into our kettle. It does take some time, but do it slow. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to start heating this thing up. There's no reason to wait on it. So pretty straightforward. What you do here is you've opened up the gas on the bottle, and we can see here we've got a green on the gauge. And I've made a little mark on my regulator where I know, kind of where the full is. I just know from my experience with my equipment, if I take this all the way up and then I back it off about 2 turns, that's the sweet spot for boiling, where it's not boiling too much off. And then all we really need to do is, stick this in here. I don't have 2 hands to do this, but basically what I'll do is I'll turn the flame on first, and then I'll open up that valve right there. I've got the flame going, and adjust my regulator. Basically, it's up to full speed right now, because I want this guy to get up to boiling pretty quickly. So now we've got the water all filled up. We've got the burner going, and we're going to let this guy get to the strike temperature we need. This is the only time during the brew day that I use the top here. Never boil with this on, you're going to have boilovers. The other time I do actually use it is after I've done a whirlpool, and I'm just letting things settle out, for 15 minutes. That way we don't get any bugs or anything like that. But I really only use it to keep the heat in when I'm not cooking, or to keep any debris out when I'm done cooking. Now that our kettle is heating up a bit more, I thought I'd spend some time talking about the mash lauter tun. So what I've got here is this Fermenter's Friend cooler, and I really haven't done too much to it, too much customization. I did put in this thermometer here with varying success. So I found that there's just too much striation of the temperatures, from top to bottom. So I think in the future I'm going to change it and get one of these longer probe thermometers. But it's at least one reading I can compare. I've got my valve here, and I've adapted this so I can have a quick disconnect. That's about it. And then here is the false bottom that comes with the Fermenter's Friend cooler. And really, not much to it. It just has a little bevel in the bottom, or a little bubble, to allow the wort to escape while the grain sits on the top. So I've cleaned the cooler out. Kind of freaky about cleaning everything because I'll be drinking whatever's in here. So I just use a little sanitizer to spray it down and wipe it out really well. And then all you really got to do is put this tube up here. And that is just about ready. And then I'll show you what I've got going on at the top here. So iFly sparge, or continuous sparge, or whatever you want to call it. And I got this little concoction here, which just makes sure that while I'm sparging, it's not disturbing the grain bed. So on the top, I've got a quick disconnect that I run the hot water through, and it just trickles down through these little tiny ports here. I also put foil on the top, but you'll see that in a bit. The next step is the hot liquor tank, or if you will, it's just basically hot water that we're going to use to sparge with. basically rinse the grains through. And same setup as the mash lauter ton. You know, thermometer and the same quick disconnect and everything. Nothing going on inside, just cleaned it out, ready for the hot water that's going to go in there in just a bit. I've hooked up my hoses in preparation for transferring the strike water into the mash lauter ton. And what I've got here is I've got this right-handed or 90-degree elbow, I should say, that you know, comes down out of the valve, goes into the bottom of the pump here. And as I was saying, I use one pump dedicated to water, so it doesn't get any kind of, you know, gunk in it. And what I'll do is I'll open this up, I'll prime it. Super important to prime these chugger pumps, these magnetic style pumps. And then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pump it into here. And I like to warm up the mash tun first. So I've also learned something about these, you know, the different gauges and things like that, which is never ever to trust them. So I would recommend always using multiple checks. So what I mean by that is I need to get my strike water to 161. That's great. I can look at this as a reference, but I've also got a digital thermometer here. Same thing with these guys. When I check my grain bed temperature, I'll use this, but I'll also check in multiple spots with this. My target strike temp was 167, and I know with my equipment I lose a few degrees moving things through the hoses and pumps, so I'm going to go up to 169 and we're about ready to get this started. So the first thing we need to do is prime the pump. So what I'm going to do is open this guy up a little bit, and because of gravity we're good to go. So I'll go ahead and turn this on. And all I want to do is put about a gallon in the mash lauter ton just to heat it up. We're just trying to get the sides all warmed up. Alright, so now we got this thing preheated. We're going to put in 4 gallons of hot water. So I'm just watching my markings here. We need to get our water salts in there. And then our lactic acid that we prepared earlier. And then we need to give it a good stir. Make sure everything's nice and dissolved. Alright, now for the grain. So we're just going to do a little bit at a time, make sure we don't get any dough balls. So I like to do about a third at a time. Give that a mix. Now for the next step. Now we're just going to take a few readings here and make sure that we're putting our target temp, which is 152. And it looks like we're just a little bit low, so I'm going to throw some more water in there. Not too much, we don't want to have too much water. Go ahead and give this another mix and check again. So my gauge that's down here says exactly 152. But taking a reading up here, let's see what I'm getting now. That's why it's important to check in multiple places. Okay, we are good. So I like to put a little bit of foil on the top. So there's a lot of dead space in this cooler. And then we'll get this guy sealed up. And then now on to the timers. So I got these off of Amazon, and really handy, just plug in your time. So this one's got it mashed for 60 minutes. And start. So now you can see that if you do all your calculations just right with Beersmith and you transfer in just the right amount of water, and your temperature probe is in exactly the right place, and it's working right, and you trust it, you hit your target mash temperature of 152. So now I've heated up my sparge water to 176. I'm targeting 174. I just happen to know that when it goes through the lines and pumps and everything, it loses about 2 degrees. So I'm going to transfer the rest of my water I have into here right now. And I'm going to use this water for multiple things. I'm going to use it to sparge, but I'm also going to use it to clean up. I'm going to use some in my fermenter when I do the sanitizer, because in my garage I don't have hot water and all this stuff, so it just makes it easier. With this Therminator here, I've discovered that you really got to get all the hops out of it first, so the best way really is to use a bag like this. And I do clean this very well every time. Don't worry about the discoloration. So what I got is one of these hop spiders, and it's got a 4-inch tri-clamp connection on it. So what I do is I just fold this up a little bit so that it won't touch the bottom when it's in there, and wrap this around here like so. And then I've got my clamp ready to go. So we'll just line that up like that. Okay. And then one other thing that I like to do, because you don't really want this thing flopping around like this in the boil, I got these 2 stainless steel ball bearings, and put these in, try to get 1 in each corner so that it weighs it down nicely, like that. And then we'll boil it just like this. The next thing that we'll do is we're going to take a pH reading to see if we hit our numbers. And I'm using this pH meter from Apera. I got one of those cheap ones off eBay or Amazon. It was one of those yellow ones, and it lasted about 3 brews, so I'd recommend spending just a little bit more money. What I've got here is I've got one of these little restaurant things that they serve ketchup in, and first thing we need to do is sit this guy in water for about 5 minutes. So there we go, I got some water in there, put it in the fill line, just let it sit. We're about at the 45-minute mark, and this is a great time to take a pH reading, so come over here. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and pull out a little bit of work. Just enough to take a reading. And then what we're going to want to do is cool this down to room temperature. That's really, even though this is a temperature compensating pH meter, we really want to get this guy down to room temperature. So I'll just keep swirling this and cooling it till it gets to about room temp. Now we've got this cooled down a little bit, and the pH meter I've taken out of the water, I've dried it off, and let's just see what we get here, see if we get lucky. You never know with these things. And look at that, 5.5, exactly what we were shooting for. Oh, there's 5.4. That's still pretty good, I'll take it. Now we're at the 37-minute mark. Let's see how we're doing on our temperatures. So our mash temperature is holding very nicely. I'm really happy with that. Our sparge water is a bit high. I really wanted that down to about like sort of 173, 172 right now, so I'll open the top later to let some of that out. I've started to hook up the next step, which is for recirculation. So you can see here that I've hooked up the out of my mash tun into my pump, and then that pump is simply just going to go right back into the cooler to recirculate. I found that I can actually shave a few minutes off the brew day. If you look at the timer over there, we're about at the 20-minute mark. And before I used to leave it in for the full 60-minute mash and then start recirculating and then start sparging, but I find that conversion is still taking place while this happens. So I'm going to start off by doing the recirculation for 10 minutes. So in order to do that, what I'm going to need to do here is I'm just going to crack open my mash tun here a little bit. And I'm going to very slowly, see if you can see this over here. I'm going to very slowly open this up. And you see how it's starting to flow in the tube there. We don't want to open it too fast, because we'll definitely get a stuck sparge. And notice, there we go. And notice here on my pump that I've got this all the way open. So I don't want to open it any more than that right now, otherwise it'll clog up. All I'm trying to do at the moment is get the pump primed. So it does take a little bit of time. You can see it's still filling. And we can probably open it up just a little bit more at this time, not too much. Alright, so what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and open this up all the way. I've shut this valve up. I'm going to turn this on and see if we can get it to start flowing. Okay, if you have a quick look in here, you can see what it's doing. It's recirculating on top of the tinfoil. Can you see that? Alright, so we'll just leave that like that, and eventually what will happen is that line down there will run completely clear. You can see now it's kind of struggling to keep up, but as that grain bed gets set, it's really just going to be one solid bit of liquid there. This is where it's handy to have two timers. So I want to recirculate for 10 minutes. Alright, and we'll just let that run for 10 minutes. We've been recirculating for about 2 minutes right now, and you can see now that it's pretty much completely solid all the way through while it recirculates. That means the grain bed is really nicely set now. You can see here we've got the draining into the foil. 10 minutes have gone by. You can see that our grain bed is down to about 143, and our hot liquor tank is at 171.5. So our goal is, once we start fly sparging here, it will bring the grain bed back up to temperature. You can see that I've now hooked up the water out to my water pump here, and then my plan is to pump the water over top of the grain bed. The next thing I'm going to do is get myself set up here. I'm going to put this right into the hop spider. I find that's a convenient way to filter out anything else that might come through. I'm also going to want to take a reading of the first bit of work to come out of here to see where we stand on our gravity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get this first pump going a little bit. And notice I've got it shut. So I'll just open this up just a tiny little bit till it starts flowing. Just a little bit, almost there. There we go, we'll take a little bit of wort out of there. And we'll let that run for just a second. We'll be alright. Just going to take a quick gravity reading on my refractometer. And we are at 1070. I'll just write that down and then see where we stand later. So now we're going to open this up just a little bit more, and the goal is to get the water going in at about the same rate as the wort flowing out of this thing. It's trying to get up there. And then if you can have a look in here, you can see the water trickling down. And I just want to make sure that our grain bed doesn't run dry. All right, we'll just let that run for a while and we'll come back. We just hit our hour-long mark, and like I was saying, that's a way to shave some time off your brew day, because it's still converting right now as we're circulating. So basically what we're doing here is the key to making this work is the reintroduction of water that keeps rinsing the sugars out of the grains here. You can see that's going on right here. We're shooting to get to probably about 6.5 to 7 gallon mark. So this is a 75-minute boil on this one. And you can see right now that we are about at the 6 gallon mark. So we're going to take a gravity reading just now, just to see where we're at. We don't want to take it until it's too low. You can see that work now is starting to run a bit clear, so I'm just going to take another quick gravity reading. Alright, we're at 1015. We definitely don't want to take too much more. Okay, so we're just going to take another gravity reading. And we are at 1042. We're ready to start cooking. So now we want to get this up to boil. Get a good hot break. Have a look inside. You can see that I've kept the water level just above the grain bed, which is great. Didn't let it run dry. Also didn't waste too much. Now I want to just start my cleanup process. So what I'll do is I'm just going to try and get the rest of the water out of here. So all I'll do is just use my pump to do that. And that's where these buckets come in handy. I just use this as my cleanup bucket. There we go. Don't want to let these pumps run without liquid in them. It's not good. Alright, so I also like to rinse out my hoses. I don't want them getting all sticky and gummy and everything. So what I'll do is I'll circulate some water through this real quick. Just open up this guy this way. And take this off of here. And then once I open this up, it should just flow right through. Give it a good rinse. Sometimes you got to get a good siphon going. There we go. Almost got it. I also like to rinse out my hoses. I don't want them getting all sticky and gummy and everything. So what I'll do is I'll circulate some water through this real quick. Just open up this guy this way. And take this off of here. And then once I open this up, it should just flow right through. Now we've just about got up to boiling, and what we're looking for is a really nice hot break here. And you can see that we've got that going on. I've turned the heat down just a little bit now. We don't want to boil over. And we'll let this simmer down for just a minute, and then we're going to add the hops. In the meantime, I've got my timer all set up. Over here you can see we're ready for the 75-minute boil. The boils simmer down a lot. The hot break has broke. And man, I tell you, it smells amazing. So now that it's at more of the boil is at a manageable rate, we don't want to boil off too much, it's time to add our first hops. I've carefully checked which packet here. It's the 1 ounce. So go ahead and put them cascade in there. And we will come over to our timer and we'll start. Here's a tip for you. Always have a standby gas bottle. This is one of the problems with brewing with propane. You can see that I've got a gauge here, so probably a good idea to pick up one of these gauges. And I'm hoping to use this until it's all gone, and then I'll switch over to this. So I've recently started trying out this propane taxi. It's been working out pretty well. Keeps me from having to go to the store and they just deliver to the door. So if you have it in your area, it's worth a look. So this is a really long boil. We're only at the 48-minute mark right now. And I wanted to show you something here. This is something I learned is not to boil too vigorously. I don't know if you can see from the steam, but I've got a good boil going, but it's not like a crazy boil where I'm going to boil off. I was having trouble hitting the gravities just right because I was actually boiling off too much. And that's how I got, I kind of got my equipment dialed in and made this mark here where I know, what's good. This recipe calls for another round of hops at the 20-minute mark, so I'll go ahead and add those now. Now I'm going to start getting my yeast nutrient together. We're about down to the 20-minute mark, and it won't be long before I'll be adding this in. Oops. See, this is what happens with homebrew. So this is the last bit of this yeast nutrient that I have here. There's probably just enough for one more go on it. I'll use this today. And then after that, I'm going to try these new ones, White Lab yeast nutrient. And from what I've heard, you can just drop these capsules in. However, I've heard some people say that it's best just to open the capsules up because they don't fully dissolve or they stick to the bottom. So yeah, we'll do that on the next brew. We're at the 15-minute mark now, and I'm going to go ahead and add in my kettle findings here, my Warflock. And I've seen different times on different manufacturers of this stuff. Some say 5 minutes, some say 10. Some say 15, so I like to go with the 15-minute mark. It works fine for me. Next up is my yeast nutrient, and it says here that you need to dissolve it in warm water about 10 minutes before the end of the boil. So that's where we've kept the sparge water here. We can reuse it for cleaning and for stuff like this. So I'll just quickly dissolve some of this yeast nutrient. We're now at the 10-minute mark, so I'm going to put my yeast nutrient into the pool here. We're now about at the 5-minute mark. We're going to add these aroma hops. A pretty nice looking packaging here. Let's put them into the hop spider. Now for another batch of aroma hops at the 1-minute mark. This is a bit like watching the ball drop at New Year's. 3, 2, 1. Alright, so that means it's time for flame out. Alright, and then one thing I really like about the hop spider is I can control the contact of the hops. So now that the time's up, I can just pull this guy out. Alright, so now I've pulled out my hop spider. You can see this is what's left here. And looks like we were just at the 5-gallon mark. Just about how it usually ends up. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start whirlpooling, and this will force all that material into the center so we don't suck it into the fermenter. So I'll go ahead and start by opening up this valve here, and you'll see this flow down. And I keep my plate chiller as part of this because what will happen is it'll sanitize the chiller as it's going around. So in order to get this to flow in, a little bit of physics here, we gotta let some air in here. Alright, and it'll start filling up and priming that pump. Alright, so now we're whirlpooling, and so I've got this, what they call a tangential port on here, which basically means it's just like at the angle where it'll make it flow along the sides, give it a nice whirlpool. And all that's happening here is it's flowing out of here into the pump, down around, it's going through my plate chiller to sanitize it like I was saying, back around the back and up into the port. And I will do this for 15 minutes. So I've got my timer set here, and then we'll come back and check on it. Alright, so we've just let it whirlpool for 15 minutes, and just have a look inside. You can see that everything's just kind of settling it out. We'll let it sit for, I don't know, 5-10 minutes, just let everything simmer down and settle down in the middle. In the meantime, I'm getting set up for the cooling. So as you can see, I've got the water hooked up here to the therminator, and it's a counterflow basically, so the water is flowing the opposite direction of the wort, and it'll cool it down, especially this time of the year. It's fall here. and it's probably about 50, 60 degrees at the moment at the most. All right, so next up, I'm going to get my fermenter. I'm going to start sanitizing it. So what I'll do is, this is where the water comes in handy. It's still warm. I don't have hot water out in my garage, so by using some hot water and some cold water, I can get a nice temperature for my sanitizer. Be right back. All right, so now I've got some water in my fermenter. I've got my star san all measured out. You can see it's got right here 1 ounce for 5 gallons. So I'll go ahead and dump that in there. Fermenter's nice and clean from the last time I brewed. So I'll just mix this up, add some more water, and I'll be right back. So we've let the fermenter sanitize for just a little bit. And now we always want to save some sanitizer for a few things we need. So we're going to need some for the blow off. So I use a mason jar for that. We're going to want to always keep a bottle of sanitizer around. Then I like keeping some in this Tupperware tub here while I'm doing my oxygenation, because I can put the wand in there and I can put my my little eyedropper in there when I take my reading. Just let that stay up. Now we're kind of fighting time, and we want to get this cooled down as quick as possible. We want to get this yeast pitched so it can prevent the growth of any bacteria. Let it take over. I do like to sanitize this portion of hose here, because this is going to be right on my fermenter. I've got my fermenter all hooked up at this point. It's all sanitized. You can see the foam. I've used these quick disconnects back here. Well, not really quick disconnects. They require a wrench, but I've just found it way easier. I've got it ready for my blow-off cane down here. So what we're going to do is, we've got this shut off here, so I'm going to go ahead and stick this in my fermenter. Now I've disconnected this hose, I've got it into my fermenter, and definitely make sure your valves are all closed. I've had that mistake before. Alright, so what we're going to do is, and we've got the water turned on, so it's starting to cool already. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to make sure that this is open, and it is. And we're going to turn this pump on. And we're going to slowly start pumping into here, just to where we see it flowing. So this should be going in here pretty cool at this point. Alright, we're still draining off. Let's see, looks like we are now around the 4 gallon mark. Again, we want to have this go slow so it cools. As we look at the fermenter, since we were last videoing, I have hooked up the SS BrewTech controller, and we can see now the temperature is currently reading 70. So, you know, great. I've set the temperature to 67, and we'll just let it go until we're done. We're getting down to the 1 gallon mark, and at this point I have slowed down the pump valve just a little bit, because I don't want it to be flowing too much. I want to be able to quickly cut it off as well when the tube starts to get sucked in the tube. We want to try and keep as much of that as possible out of the fermenter. We're now at about the half gallon mark, and you can really start to see that cone of trube that's settled in the middle of the pot or the kettle. And we're going to watch this right down to the bottom. We want to get as much wort as possible here without sucking in too much of that junk. And you're really going to be able to see it in a minute. You can see, maybe from this angle, you can see how clear that wort is, and you see we're sucking in just a little bit of trube right there. So just a minute, I'm going to click this thing off, and I'm going to stop it. A little bit more physics. We don't want to lose too much wort here. We don't want too much trube or gunk in the fermenter. And you can see I got quite a bit tied up here, probably a good quarter gallon tied up in these lines and in the therminator. So I've learned how to delicately use gravity to basically clear out this line here all the way through down to the fermenter. So give me just a moment to do that and I'll show you the end result. I carefully pulled one of those lines off at a time and dumped everything I could into the fermenter. And my guess is we've probably got about 4.5 gallons in there. I can't really see right now. But next thing I'm going to do is I've had an eyedropper floating in the sanitizer here. I'm going to take a reading real quick. So I'll be right back and let you know the results. I just took a specific gravity reading and we hit 1055 at 4.75 gallons. So yeah, one thing I've learned is you never get 5 gallons in the fermenter unless you overcompensate. There's always losses. So, all right, so next step, I am going to oxygenate. So I've already got my oxygen line. It's been sitting here soaking in some sanitizer. I'm going to spray the rest of it down and then I'll be back. So we're going to oxygenate. So I don't have necessarily an oxygen meter to know exactly what the oxygen level is in the beer, but there's kind of a rule of thumb here. So I've got a flow meter on here, some of these medical flow meters, and I want to have this flowing at 0.5 for 30 seconds. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn this guy on, get up to 0.5, and we'll see some sanitizer foam happening here. And I'll probably just sit this up on my other fermenter. The next thing we're going to do here is we've got this clarity foam from White Labs. This is kind of neat. It goes in the fermenter rather than having to use gelatin or something like that. So we'll put that in there. All right. Next up, we have our yeast. Important step here. Notice the magnet holding the stir bar. If you forget that, it's going to end up in your fermenter, and then you got to wait until the fermentation's done. So I'll just give this a little swirl. And into the fermenter we go. Oops. Don't spill your yeast. Alright, so put these clamps down. Alright. And finally, I always use a blow off during fermentation just because you don't know what's going to happen. So, similar as my plant. Blow off on. So you can see over here that it's going into a jar. Can you see that? So we've got a mason jar full of sanitizer, and that's it. We'll just set it and forget it. One thing you probably didn't notice is that I've been cleaning as I've been going along, so that's probably a good thing to do. It's like a good chef. But now that the brew's over, I need to do something a bit more here. So what I've got going on is I've taken 5 ounces of PBW, and I've got my kettle, and I'm going to use the burner. I'm going to heat up 5 gallons of this stuff, and what I'll do with it is I'll recirculate it through all the lines that I've used, through my therminator down here, just make sure everything is super clean, and then I'll give it a rinse with fresh water for next time. I like to heat my water to between, probably about 120 to 140 is good. You don't want to make it too hot, but you also want to, have it do a good job cleaning. These gloves were a really good investment. They keep all the chemicals, even though the chemicals they're using aren't terribly harsh, but they keep your hands from drying out, and they also protect you a little bit from the heat. So I'd recommend using these while you're cleaning everything up. Just like before when we were whirlpooling, well, now we're whirlpooling PBW, and you can see it's going to be cleaning out the inside of the pot a little bit. It's going to be cleaning out the pump. It's going to be cleaning out my therminator, all the hoses and everything else as well. So I'll let this run for just a bit, and then I'll come back and rinse each hose with water, and make sure every single hose that I've used today will get run through like this. Well, that's another brew day in the books. So I've gone ahead and rinsed everything through. Like I said, I rinsed out the hoses. They're all hanging up. Rinsed out the kettle. I've actually used the PBW and some of the fresh water to clean up my garage floor. So I like to take this along with the squeegee here and just get everything clean. I mean, I know it's not a total food safe environment, but you know, I try to keep it as clean as I can. You can see that I've got my notes here, my brew day notes that I'll take upstairs and record. I've got everything cleaned up, sanitized. I've got my filter over here for next time, my Therminator. You need to store them this way because they need to drain out. They're slow to drain. I've got my pumps partially open. I've got caps on them to keep any kind of bugs. We don't want any kind of weird spider's nest or anything. This is a fermenter that's crashing at the moment. That'll be ready to keg soon. This is the one we did today, so it's currently at 66. And after the brew day is over, I go back and put all my notes in my OneNote here. You see I got pictures of the grains. I've got the yeast, I've got the hops, and I make sure I plug these into Beersmith so I have the exact acid amounts. And then I keep a copy of my brew day sheet. And then what I'll do is I'll come over here to Beersmith and plug in my actual session data, so you can see the mash pH that we measured and the gravity we got right before we put it in the kettle. So we had 1042 at 6.75 gallons. And then into the fermenter, if you remember, we had 4.75 gallons and we hit 1055. All right, so that looks like we got a mash efficiency of 65.8%. So that wasn't awesome, but not bad. And then 72% on the brew house efficiency. So it looks like we're going to hit an ABV of looks like about 5.2. Depends on how much how the yeast, you know, how much attenuation we have. We've got our yeast profile here, so let's just go ahead and have a look at this. Probably what we'll do is we'll have it at 67 for 3 days. That'll give it a chance to probably be about 50% done with fermentation, if not more. Then what we'll do is we'll ramp the temp up for a couple days to really help it clean up and finish off. And then after that, we'll take it back down. I'll probably go ahead and take it back down for another 7 days. Just let it clean up. And then have it finish at 72. Actually, I'm sorry. I'll take it back down to 67. And then after that, I'll go ahead and crash it. And that should really help it clean up. All right. There we go. That's what our fermentation profile looks like. So now we'll just wait to check back in the morning and see if it's bubbling. Good morning. It's Sunday, the day after we brewed, and this thing's already going crazy. I don't know if you can see the line on the blow off that's just flexing, and then you can see down here how it's just bubbling away. I'll shut up for a minute and you can just watch it bubble. So that's great. And you see we got the temperature set at 66. All right, so we'll check back again soon. It's Monday morning and the fermentation is still going on pretty actively. It's getting about 1 heartbeat per second here. Today is Tuesday and there's still a lot of activity. Probably about 1 heartbeat every 2 seconds. I'll let you listen to that. Okay, so what I could do now is take a gravity reading, but I'm pretty confident that we're at least at the 50%, if not more, attenuation point. So what I like to do is just to keep it simple. When I put my yeast in initially, I set the temperature to the lower end of the recommendation by the manufacturer. So in this case, it was 67 to 72. So I initially set it to 67. And then at 50% attenuation, I like to go ahead and ramp it up. to kind of help speed everything up, make sure everything gets, cleaned up and everything. So I'll go ahead and set the temperature up to 72. And then we'll do this for 2 days and we'll take it back down. It's Wednesday morning and the activity has slowed a little bit. I can still hear it going. It's going about once every 4 seconds. You can see here we're sitting at about almost 71 degrees right now. It's Thursday morning. The activity in the airlock has slowed down a lot. I think I'm seeing like a bubble, like every 30 seconds or something like that. So at this point, we're about, 4 or 5 days into fermentation. I've ramped the temperature up for 2 days. And then what I like to do is for the next week, I'm going to put the temperature just right in the middle of the range they recommend. So this is WLP 001. I think the range is between 68 and 73 or 68 and 72. So I'll just go ahead and put it right in the middle. I'll just shoot for, let's call it 70. All right, there we go. Check back with you next time. Through the magic of video, a bunch of time has passed. I'm pretty confident that this ale is done at this point, so there's a couple things that I'm going to do. The first thing is I'm going to take off the blow-off tube, and I'm going to put on an S-lock airlock on there, an S-type airlock. And what that's going to do is that's going to prevent suckback, because after I take a gravity reading here in a moment, I'm also going to start crashing it if it's ready. So let me go ahead and remove the blow off and I'll show you the S-lock. I've pulled some, taken a reading out of here. And that's another advantage of having these S-type airlocks on here is that, if you leave the hose connected, what'll end up happening is it'll suck back that sanitizer up the hose into the fermenter, either when you're crashing or when you're taking readings like this. So interestingly enough, this wasn't what I expected the color of this to turn out like. I really expected this to be like an amber ale, but I guess it's more like maybe like a British style. So let's see what that reading is. It's definitely below, looks like 1010. I don't know if I can zoom in on here too well, but this is definitely done cooking. All right, so I'm going to throw the dry hops in next. So we've got 1 ounce of these Cascade pellet hops that I've set aside. And I'll just drop them in the fermenter. No need for a bag or anything like that. It'll all settle out. I've dumped the hops into the fermenter. I took that S-lock off of there. And now what I'm going to do is fill up the S-lock with vodka. I had thrown some sanitizer in there just to clean it out beforehand. But one nice thing about using vodka is when we start crashing especially, it's going to be sucking back liquid, and if any of this vodka gets sucked in, it's better than sanitizer, right? Worst case, it's just going to add a little bit of alcohol to your brew. So let me concentrate on pouring this in. Okay, so that's more than enough in there. After taking a gravity reading and adding our dry hops, I've come back up to my office and I'm going to record my notes. And you can see here that I put in some date information, when I took the reading. I thought it was 1010, but after looking at the picture closely and looking at the meniscus, it really looks like 1008. So I added the dry hops. We'll start crashing it Sunday. So then, you can see I put the picture in here. Next, I'll go into Beersmith and I'll add my reading. So you can see here, you can keep a list of readings here. But the important one is this right here. So our final gravity is 1008, puts our ABV at 6.2. Pretty good because Beersmith estimated we were going to hit 6.4. And then you can see I've also plugged in those numbers here because I'm not doing a secondary with that chronicle or anything like that. We've been cold crashing now for a number of days. Now it's time to get it into the keg. So I'm going to do what's called a closed transfer today. And the way this works is we're going to use CO2 to pressurize the fermenter. It's going to come out of the line and go into the keg, never touching oxygen along the way. So let me just show you all the detailed parts here. First is I have a small CO2 bottle, which I find really convenient. I keep that separate from my kegerator bottle, which is over here. And I use this just for closed transfers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first sanitize everything. So you can see down here in this little Tupperware container I like to use, I've got some parts I'm going to sanitize. And the way this is going to work, at least on the SS BrewTech, is we have this, this is a 1.5 inch pressure relief valve, and basically if the pressure gets to be too high, it's just going to push up on this spring, let the air out. That way you don't have an exploding fermenter. So I guess the first tip here is to make sure that your fermenter is rated to be pressurized. So we're going to hook that guy up to here after we take off our airlock. We're going to take this end and we're going to hook it up to our keg in. We're going to purge it to get any oxygen out of there. And then what we'll do is we'll take this other line that's down here and we will connect that right here. And then we'll screw it on to the end of this hose here. And then on the other end of the hose, we'll put one of your standard connectors, which will end up going to the beer inline over here. All right, so I'm going to pressurize all this. I'm going to transfer beer in here, but before I do that, the first thing I'm going to do is sanitize everything. So I'm going to mix up a batch of Star San, we'll get the keg all sanitized, and then I'll come back for keg assembly. We don't have a professional, stainless steel sink in our brewery. Unfortunately, we've got to use the bathtub here. But anyway, I filled the keg up with Star San. I like to use the dip tube here as a stir stick just to make sure everything's stirred well. I've also got all the components down here in my Tupperware, and there's my Star San. So I'll let this soak for just a few minutes and then we'll be ready. Back out in the garage brewery, we've got everything ready to go. I'm going to start assembling this keg. So let me get out all my O-rings and everything. I like to use a little bit of keg lube here. Helps it seal, helps protect the O-rings. So now I've got everything out that's ready to get the keg lubed in assembly. And then I've even got my 7/8 wrench in here and the hose and everything and the pressure valve in here. Can't be too cautious. I got the post back on here, and you can see inside the keg, maybe not, but there's lots of good foam in there. So we've already lubed this up. We're going to go ahead and install this next. Now we're going to purge the keg. So you can see that I've got this one closed off. This is the one going to my pressure valve, and the other one is going up to my keg. So I'll turn this on. We're going to crank this up to 30. This CO2 bottle's a bit smaller, so it takes a little bit longer to fill up. And we'll do that about 5 times. This is also a good opportunity to check for any leaks. All right, so now we'll go ahead and shut that off. By the way, if you don't turn on the right valve, it'll start bubbling out here. And that's not what we want. I meant to hit this valve. Okay, and now what we can do is we can turn this pressure down, and I can go ahead and back it off down here. Because for the next step, we're going to want this like at 2 psi. All right, next, we need to open this valve. And I'm going to do that last, but essentially what will happen is if we don't open this valve, there's CO2 in here under pressure. And as we try to push out through the line that I'm going to connect in just a minute, it won't be able to overcome the pressure and it'll just sit there locked. So we need to open this to let some of the air out as the liquid comes in. We also need to disconnect this CO2 line because we don't want any trouble with CO2 going back in or anything like that at this point. So I'll go ahead and disconnect that. This valve has been sitting like this for quite some time. And if you think about it, the beer is going to be passing through here. So this is just another opportunity to pick up something. So we're going to go ahead and sanitize in here as well. Let that soak for a bit. I've got that connected now. All sanitized on the inside. Next thing I did was I got my hose, and although it was soaking in the sanitizer, I really like to be sure that it got sanitizer down inside of it. So I went ahead and sprayed some down into the hose, and I'm just letting it drain out now. 2 wrenches you should have in your brewery here. The 7/8 for the keg post. The 9/16 are great for these hose lines. I've got the hose all tightened up. On the other end, I've hooked up my quick disconnect for beer. And you'll notice that this is going to the outline of the beer. I've also disconnected the CO2 at this point. We don't want to have any risk of pushing air back in and going back into the fermenter. It's happened to me before. We're done with the controller at this point. I'll go ahead and turn this off and get it out of the way. Next, we'll get rid of this airlock, and we're going to hook up our pressure valve that's down here soaking in sanitizer. The airlock is now off, and in its place we have this pressure valve. What I'll do now is I will open this up and pressurize the fermenter. So right now we have hardly any pressure here. So we're going to take it up to about 2 to 3 psi. All right, and you can hear it flowing in there. And if I were to lift this up a little bit, you can hear the air coming out. That's kind of the safety aspect of it. So now that our fermenter is pressurized, our keg is pressurized too, by the way. And that's a reminder for me to go ahead and open up this relief valve. And we're going to turn it to keep it open this whole time. All right, so now that's turned, that's completely open. We'll start the flow of beer. And I'll do this slowly. And there we go. Now we see the flow of some nice clear beer coming in here. I think between the Clarity, Clarity Firm from White Labs, the cold crashing, you know, keeping all the trub out of the fermenter, I think this should be ready to drink after it's carbonated. I don't know if you hear that, but this valve is actually blown just a little bit. It means I've got my pressure up just a little bit too high. There we go. So I backed it down just a little bit. Now you can see it's sitting at the recommended level. You can hear it going into the keg. Now in the summertime, it's kind of neat that because it's so hot outside and the inside of the beer is so cold, you can actually watch the line as it rises, and you can trace it all the way up. One thing you don't want to do is overfill these kegs, and I'll show you a little trick that you can use for that. This is an inexpensive shipping scale that you can get off of Amazon. Now, I made a mistake here, and hopefully I can save someone else some pain, but I got a 35-pound scale. And I came to learn, I thought that would cover all my needs, you know, for weighing grains out and things like that. But I came to find that a full keg weighs somewhere, I think my keg with all, you know, filled to the brim is like 40-some pounds. So this thing will air out. But let me put it on here to show you. We can at least fill it like 3/4 of the way full, and you could get the idea that you could measure, you know, put liquid into your keg, say up to here, and then measure it, and you know exactly when to stop filling it. Probably more important when you're doing 10-gallon batches, or, you know, if you're doing basically more than 5 gallons. I've got the keg up on a scale now, and we're able to monitor it as it gets filled up. It's got about 15 pounds in it right now. So, oh, you can actually see the line. Can you see this right here? Even though it's not summertime, we can clearly see where the level of the beer is right now. So we'll just keep an eye on that. Well, you can hear that it's done. Basically what's happened is all the beer's flown out of here, and at this point it's just pumping CO2 in there. So go ahead and shut this off. I've lifted the keg into the kegerator. I've hooked up the line here, and what I'll do is I will set this to 30 and we'll purge it again, and then after that we're going to let it sit for 2 days at 30. So first, purge. And you can see my CO2 is getting low. It'll be time for a refill soon. And I'm getting little whiffs of the beer as this comes out. It smells great. Alright. So now we'll turn this up to 30. And you'll hear it moan a little bit. Alright, we'll let it sit like that for a couple days. Take it down to serving pressure, it'll be ready to drink. Now, one important thing I want you to notice here is that the beer line is not hooked up at this point. It's actually sitting here on my shelf. I find these shelves are really handy for just holding on to the lines that aren't in use. The reason that is because this is under 30 psi of pressure, and I don't know if my beer lines are really capable of holding that much beer, and also we just don't want any accidents happening, like somebody thinks it's ready to drink and it just explodes out of there. So best to keep it disconnected until it's at serving pressure. One other thing I'd like to share here is that I've got my beer line disconnected, but it's sitting here full of sanitizer. So this is my run back to the taps here, and I did a video last week of cleaning these all out, but I like to leave sanitizer in the lines until I'm ready to drink. Well, that's about it for tonight. We'll check back when it's ready to drink. Can't wait. Now wait a minute, did you think you were done? Nope, unfortunately, one of the downsides of kegging a beer is that now you have to clean up. This is kind of an interesting looking mess in here. You can see that we did pull down almost all the beer in here, and there's some nice hop gunk. This is probably when I was dry hopping. And you can see that the ring actually got it pretty high this time, and this is why we use a blow off, because you never know. So next time I'm going to disconnect this, I'll take it inside and I'm going to soak it with some PBW. I spared you. I've cleaned everything up. You can see that the fermenter's all cleaned out, nice and shiny, dry, a little bit of PBW, just a little bit of elbow grease. I've also broken down everything. So here's all the parts. Gotta let them dry, rinsed out, soaked in PBW, ready to go for next time. Not long now, we'll be drinking. All right, well, it's been in the keg for a little while. It's had a chance to carbonate. This is our first pour of this amber ale, and it's looking pretty nice. Looks like that cleared up a little bit. Decent head on there. All right, well, let's give this a drink and see how it is. That's really good, really good. Well, thank you all for joining me for this end-to-end video. I hope you find it helpful.